family mode.
Hello, and welcome to part 1 of the How Fit is Your HCM webinar series. Today, we will be talking about how is your HR's core strength and conditioning. My name's Janice Sloan, and I will be your moderator for today's event. But before we begin, just a few housekeeping measures. Today's webinar will be recorded and made available online. We will send a link to access the webinar and the slide deck within a couple hours of today's webinar. Also, your mics are on mute, so if you have questions, simply type them in the questions box. Today's presenters are Stacey Harris and Erin Spencer. Stacey is the Vice President of Research and Analytics for Sierra-Cedar. She runs Sierra-Cedar's annual HR System Survey and Research. Stacey has been a leading member of the HR practices and technology research community since 2007. She is known for her groundbreaking research on high-impact HR organizations, enterprise HR technologies, and key practices across the talent management spectrum. Also joining Stacey today is Erin Spencer. Erin is a research consultant at Sierra-Cedar, assisting Stacey with the programming and analysis of the HR System Survey. Her previous experience includes research and analysis at Brandon Hall Group, along with learning administration at ACS Learning Services. Stacey and Erin frequently present their unique expertise and advice to national audiences and author HCM articles in industry publications. We are excited to have you both join us today. I will now turn today's presentation over to Stacey, who will tell us more about Sierra-Cedar and this year's mid-market survey results.
Thanks, Jan. I appreciate it. And hello, everyone. I hope everyone is, wherever you're at, is staying cool. If you're here in the United States and you're dealing with some of the heat wave, we were just talking about that, or wherever you're at, you're having wonderful weather in the afternoon or time frame that you're in. As Jana has said, we are going to be talking a little bit today about the mid-market data that came out of our annual HR system survey. It's sort of a breakout of that data, so we'll be covering sort of what happened in the broader technology research and how that sort of fits into the mid-market, and talking about how you fit that into sort of taking care of your overall health of your enterprise HR technology system strategy. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Real briefly, just to sort of let you know a little bit about Sierra-Cedar. Sierra-Cedar is a management consulting organization primarily focused on the areas around business intelligence, application services, infrastructure services. They've got a little over 1,500 projects and a little over 900 employees in the organization. But more important to me and most important to everybody here who is on the call is that for the last 19, now going on 20 years, they have really invested heavily in the thought leadership research around HR technology and HR systems environments. This year will be our 20th year of the Enterprise HR Systems Annual Survey, and Erin and I will talk a little bit about that and what you can expect from that going forward as well today. Real quickly, Janice did a wonderful job introducing Erin and myself, but if you want to touch base with us, have any questions about the research or interested in anything else that maybe we've done in our past, you're more than welcome to connect up with us on LinkedIn, and also please feel free to tweet about the webinar today or connect with us on Twitter at Stacey Harris HR and at Erin HR. All right, well, let's get started a little bit in what we're talking about today. So for those of you who might have come in and have not previously participated in any of our survey webinars or any of our previous events talking about the research that we've done, we'll give you a little bit of an overview. If you do have questions on today's presentation, feel free to put them in the Q&A box. We'll try to answer them as we go along. Erin and I are pretty good about that. We're going to make it a conversation. We try and make this something that is helpful for everybody who's participating. But as I had noted earlier, we have over 19, going on our 20th year right now, continuous years of data gathering in the HR technology space. We really cover everything in that spectrum, from strategy, process, and structure around your enterprise HR technology systems to the applications you're investing in and planning to put in place, such as payroll, core HRMS, your service delivery technology, your workforce management, talent management, BI and analytics applications. But we also cover things like how things work when they're integrated and what happens from an implementation timeline perspective and resourcing and what's happening from an emerging perspective around technologies. So we really cover the wide spectrum. We know the survey's long, we break all the rules, we understand that, but it also gives us the opportunity when you do participate in our research to show you a bigger picture, to understand the ecosystem of the enterprise HR system environment. We are open right now through July 2nd for our current 20th annual survey. Please feel free to participate if you haven't already, and you can download our annual report, the larger 19th annual report, free from our website, and you can also download the mid-market report that we're going to be talking about today. One of the things that we really wanted to share today is not just sort of share what's happening from the mid-market perspective around HR technology environments, but really talk about it in the context of why organizations need to pay attention to HR technology at an enterprise level when they're in this mid-market range. And it's important for us to maybe point out that mid-market, for the perspectives of the breakout of this data that we're going to be talking about today, is really organizations that are between 1,000 and 5,000 employees within their organization. And we've tried to share the data in a way that gives you a sense of sort of how it compares to some of our large or global data sets or to our aggregate data set. If not, you can ask some questions about that if you have any. But we really find that those organizations between 1,000 and 5,000 employees are at a point, an inflection in their development and maturity in the market where they really need to think about things differently. They have to understand sort of the broader things that are affecting their business and company that sometimes are as much about the internal aspects as they are about the external aspects. So Erin, you maybe want to talk a little bit, we'll bring you back into the conversation and have some discussions about what we mean when we talk about an enterprise HR system strategy and what type of mid-market organizations are investing in that type of an enterprise HR system strategy.
Sure. When we talk about an enterprise HR system strategy, it's basically, does your organization have a strategy that you're using to influence and deal with your HR systems and solutions? So just the same way your business hopefully would have a strategy and a roadmap of where you want to go, maybe a 5-year plan, does your organization have the same thing for your technology? And I personally, I love strategy. I love strategizing. I'm the person that writes down every morning what I want to get done every day. So this to me is just, it's a natural thing, and I truly don't always understand why organizations wouldn't have that. Or if you notice, one of the interesting things that comes out of this is 11% of the people that answer our survey, which is about HR systems and technology, don't even know if their organization has one or not. So, that's, to me, these are missed opportunities. But as you can see, 26% of the organizations we survey in this mid-market group have a regularly updated HR system strategy. 28% are developing a strategy. And if you go up in size, you'll find that larger organizations are more likely to have a strategy versus the organizations that are just a bit smaller.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important component to this, which is that oftentimes we feel like, oh, the big companies need a strategy for their enterprise HR systems, but as a small company or a mid-market company, is that really necessary? We just sort of fill our needs. We need a recruiting system. We buy a recruiting system. We need to have a compliance system for our core compliance components, and we put in place a core HRMS environment. What we're finding is that the enterprise HR system really provides value, and it provides not only sort of a short-term look at what organizations are planning to do with their HR technology, but it provides an opportunity for organizations to really look at the data and make some business decisions around the data they're seeing within their organization, which oftentimes is hard to do without having enterprise systems within your organization. Erin, do you want to talk a little bit about what the difference is between sort of a compliance-driven HR technology organization versus maybe sort of an organization that's seen as a little bit more strategic, and what our data is seeing here?
Absolutely. So one of the points that Stacey made was the idea of the difference between a more compliance-driven function and a more strategic function. Now, we all know that HR has to be compliant. You need to have some compliance aspects. You need to be filling out the right forms, and you need to make sure that you have the right information about your employees. You need to make sure you're not breaking any rules, that there are a lot of laws, labor regulations, etc., that you need to be paying attention to within your organization. I am in no way suggesting that you should not be focusing on those things. However, the next evolution in terms of an HR department and strategy becomes whether or not your organization actually has a focus on talent and business, and it's not just compliance driven. So we looked at these organizations based on whether or not you're seen as only having a compliance function in your HR strategy versus actually being being seen as a business partner to the organization. And organizations, you can see that don't have a regularly updated HR system strategy are more likely to be seen as just a compliance function than those who have a regularly updated HR system strategy.
That's 3 times more likely. I mean, that's a lot. That's we look at the data, we're like, oh, yeah. And the value of having an enterprise HR system strategy is very similar to sort of the value of having, you know, an annual review of where you're at from a health perspective and a long-term goal for where you want to be in the future. It's very similar to sort of the approach you take to taking care of yourself, taking care of your business at an enterprise level. Your enterprise HR technology is a big part of ensuring that your organization is functioning the way it's supposed to be functioning, that all the data is getting to all the parts and pieces within the organization that need to be there, and of making sure that your organization ultimately has the capability to exceed in the goals it's trying to achieve, much like any kind of investment you might make in your own health or your own environment within your personal lives, right? So one of the things we took a look at is that sort of the flip side of the previous question that we had talked about, which is for those organizations who have an enterprise HR system strategy, how do they compare if we look at those organizations who are seen as more strategic, that have, and what we found is that 45% of mid-market organizations with a regularly updated HR system strategy are more likely to be viewed by all levels of management as strategic, as adding strategic value versus organizations that have no HR system strategy. So what we're really seeing is that those organizations who invest in enterprise HR system strategy really end up being the ones who get that seat at the table, who are talking about more than just how to remove risk from your organization's HR environment. We're talking about how HR technology can help an organization add value to the business outcomes. Another way of looking at that is we always ask organizations about their annual business outcomes in areas such as things like their ability to be innovative, their ability to manage market shifts, their ability to be competitive in the markets. We have about 5 or 6 of these business outcomes that we ask organizations every year about. We ask, are these their things that have gone up or down in the last 12 months? And what we find is that on average, those organizations who have that enterprise HR system strategy, who are in the mid-market space, again, this is just mid-market data, so this is, you could say, well, those are large organizations, smaller, these are just these mid-market organizations. Those organizations are much more likely, almost 15% more likely, to have a higher overall average of their business outcomes ratings on that 1 to 5 scale that we ask about than those who don't have an enterprise HR system. And similarly, those organizations who end up in what we call our top 10%, those organizations who are at the really top of that average outcome, business outcome metric, right, they're 2 times more likely to have an enterprise HR system strategy. So there's real value in investing in this. Just like there's value in investing in any kind of a checkup or an approach you're taking to your health, you really want to think about your enterprise HR system strategy as a starting point, a place where you can make some decisions about where your organization is heading, what it's trying to achieve from a technology perspective, not just a process and practices perspective. So to talk a little bit about what is an HR system strategy, because that's always the question. It's great, I need an enterprise HR system strategy. What does it include, right? And Erin and I have sort of gone around this by sort of, in a different ways, asking organizations what do they include in their various elements of an enterprise HR system strategy. And everybody's a little bit different in this, we find. But generally find there's really 5 or 6 things that people sort of include. One is they always include some sort of a current state assessment. Now, whether that's a benchmark that you do compared to sort of something like our research, which is open and free and available, that you can sort of compare yourself and say, okay, here's where we're at, here's where everyone else is at. It just gives a current state. Some organizations will leverage data from an organization where they would go and pay to have an assessment or a benchmark done. Some organizations do this by going to members within their industry and actually doing their own little sort of data gathering and saying, so what do you have compared to what I have? So they have a lot of networking that they'll do this in. But the idea is just to get a sense of, compared to where everyone else is at, here's our current state of enterprise HR technology environments. What's the applications we have in place? Where do they sit? How long have we had them in place? Where do, you know, what's the connections between all of them? And what does that compare to everyone else in the market that we feel that we are comparative to? We also see that organizations generally, we have some sort of a blueprint in place. A blueprint being something where they have identified what their business goals are, what their enterprise HR strategies are, and what their enterprise system strategies are. So there's always a broader system strategy and how the enterprise HR technology fits into that, right? So no longer are we just trying to sort of achieve a recruiting goal, but is there a broader talent goal we're trying to achieve, and what does that look like, right? And then generally there's always some sort of an action plan in place, some sort of a long-term roadmap. In the next 3 years we're going to implement these 3 systems, we're going to connect these 3 systems, we're going to pull the data together in these type of environments, we're going to communicate with everybody in this way. And I always tell people that if you're going to do a strategy, make sure you have included measures and key performance indicators. I can't emphasize this enough. If you aren't measuring it, you really don't know how far you've come. If you don't know where you started and where you're trying to get to. These measures can be anything from efficiency, they can be outcomes you're trying to achieve. The key performance indicators can be things you expect your organization to be able to accomplish when you reach a certain goal, but it's really important to have measures in any kind of a strategy. And finally, who's going to make the decisions on an ongoing basis, how are you going to maintain the technology environment, and what type of change management will you be putting in place on a regular basis. And without a doubt, we always get questions about this, but most organizations have some level of what type of resources they need, both in budgeting, contingency plans if decisions don't get made, or if timelines don't get hit, and in some cases what type of things they've decided they're not going to implement, they're simply going to outsource. And that's a lot of areas where organizations make some decisions about. So it's really focused on sort of making sure that you have a broad picture of what you're doing in an enterprise HR technology environment. Very similar to if you're looking at your own health, understanding how you compare to other people, understanding what your long-term goals are, understanding how you're going to reach those goals, understanding whether or not you're going to have a coach maybe who helps you, whether you're going to be making all the decisions, understanding what kind of incentives you're going to be putting in place, and understanding how much you're going to invest in that type of training and core exercising that you need to do to reach your goals. So those are kind of how we connect all the dots on this. Erin, do you want to talk a little bit about how people should look at this benchmarking conversation? We have a lot of people come to us because we do the research on benchmarking. How should they think about benchmarking differently than maybe they are today?
Right. So one of the important things about benchmarking is trying to figure out to whom you're going to compare yourself. So if you're going back to the fitness analogy and you're looking at, mile times and you want to know, like, how fast should I be able to run a mile? Well, you're not going to compare yourself to the guy who won in the Olympics. Like, just, you're not going to be there. So you're going to look at people that are maybe similar, in the same shape as you are. So maybe you'll look at, you'll ask some of your friends. You'll see, we'll talk about cohorts. And, are you looking at people that are your same age group, your same size? So essentially, when we look at benchmarking, we look at a lot of different things, but we look at whether or not someone's an early technology adopter. So our little clouds with arrows going up and down are our high cloud and our low cloud groups. So our high cloud groups have a software as a service / cloud solution for their HRMS, their payroll, their workforce management, and their talent management solution. The low cloud groups do not. They could have cloud for some of those things, or 3 out of the 4, but not for all of them. So you can see the compared, are they early technology adopters? And then again, we compare them to everyone, our worldwide overall averages. We can also look at things by size, as this particular webinar is focusing on more of the mid-market, but if you wanted to go smaller or larger. And then we can look at region, whether you're a big company based in the US or Canada or EMEA or APAC, or if you're global or not global, or your industry. A healthcare organization can behave very differently than a financial services organization, and we often see that when we look at technology and overall technology adoption. So, but it's important to be just aware of your own organization and where you fit and to whom you would like to compare yourself.
And categorization is really important when you're thinking about sort of getting a sense of your assessment of yourself compared to someone else, because if you don't categorize right, oftentimes what you're doing is either comparing yourself to someone who isn't trying to reach the same goals as you are, or more importantly, doesn't have the same issues you're dealing with. And those are 2 important things that you've got to keep in mind. One of the things I always tell with benchmarking is if you're comparing yourself, you're global, and someone you're comparing yourself to is not as global as you are, you're definitely going to be seeing differences in how you benchmark, because a global organization requires, from our data set at least, we're seeing that they generally have almost twice the amount of administrative support in their HR technology environment. They're much more likely to have multiple systems in place, and that comparison is necessary because they've got a lot of areas that they're covering, a lot of regions with different outcomes, compared to someone who only maybe is working in North America or only working in one country or one region. Those 2 organizations are going to have different requirements, similar things from a benchmarking perspective. The other thing that we always see when we're talking about HR system strategies is that really understanding that blueprint component seems to be a hard place for people to start. So we sort of threw some areas in here sort of similar to sort of understanding sort of how you get started when you're doing your own health plan, right? The personal relationship that you have with sort of exercise and food and the amount of things that you sort of put into your body versus not put into your body, right, when you're dealing with health issues. It's very similar to what we're dealing with when we're dealing with enterprise business decisions and technology and how those two things work together, because there's always this tension between sort of business needs and business outcomes and technology capabilities and realities, right? And so one of the things we always talk to organizations about is really understanding, particularly at that mid-market level, this is really important at the mid-market level, what are your organization's enterprise goals? What are you trying to achieve? Is it more market share? Is it revenue? Is it shareholder profit? Is it innovation? Knowing those key areas where your organization is trying to achieve outcomes is critical to really getting down to what HR needs to be able to accomplish and what HR's technology needs to be accomplished through them. The other question we always ask organizations is, what are your organization's key performance indicators? Now that may be something you're sort of like, well, we track some various data, you know, on a regular basis. We know year-over-year sales, or we look at, you know, the percentage of, you know, sort of market up and down. But what we really are looking at in this case is, what are the metrics that your organization tracks on a regular basis? What's in front of the managers? What are they held accountable to? And so in many cases, those are talent metrics, they might be enterprise metrics, they might be performance metrics. Knowing those is really critical to having a better understanding of what your HR technology needs to put out in some cases, being able to achieve for an organization. And finally, what areas of the HR impact goal achievement or key indicators do you need to be able to take care of, right? What areas is HR being held accountable to? And this is a really hard one, because oftentimes we think, well, HR has the people, they're held accountable to everything, or vice versa. Well, HR is just compliance and they're not held accountable to doing anything other than making sure that we're a compliant organization, particularly in the mid-market function, where you may not have someone who is at a senior level heading up HR in some cases. Well, first of all, my recommendation would be to always have someone at a senior level who's heading up HR. But if that's not the case, many times that's not sort of in the plan that an organization has, really understanding that HR has a big component of what an organization can achieve when it comes to the critical talent you need within your organization, understanding the processes you want to put in place in your organization, understanding the approaches and the culture your organization needs to achieve the outcomes that you're looking for. And so really those are important questions to talk about. Are these areas direct or supporting impacts that HR might have? You know, can HR do these directly, or do they need to work through managers and through operations to achieve these in many cases? Are they areas that are working or broken? If you're really trying to achieve efficiency, or if you're really trying to achieve performance outcomes, is the process that is going towards your performance actually allowing people to achieve the highest level of performance, or is the process is broken? Do we need to address this? Are the systems not connected? Do we need to get to those fixed? So really understanding what HR can impact and how connected they are to the goals is a big part of this. When we look at enterprise HR system strategies and what organizations have done, we try to take sort of a different approach to that. And so what we do is we, through our research, take a look at what we call the HCM application blueprint. This is basically us sort of looking backwards and saying, if we took the average of everybody in our organization and pulled it together, what in our research have they adopted over time and connected over time and built into their blueprint? So Erin, I'll let you talk a little bit about what this is and what these average percentages mean for the mid-market organizations here.
Sure. So this blueprint is kind of like, going back to the fitness analogy, kind of like going to the gym. You know, if you're big, your basic standard 24-hour fitness or FitWorks or whatever the large gym is in your neighborhood, you know, you walk in there and you see an entire row of treadmills, and then maybe you see some elliptical machines, and then you see some bikes, and then you see some weights, you know, and there are certain things you always see in one of these gyms, and those are kind of like our administrative applications. So almost all of the time, organizations have a core HRMS. You have payroll. You do some sort of benefits administrations. Not quite. You don't always have embedded HR analytics, but all four of those together average out to a 92% adoption, just kind of like the treadmill in the gym. Everybody has those things. And then you kind of go into more specialized material. Do you have spin bikes? Do you have yoga classes? Are there certain other things you do? Do you have rowing machines? So when you go into the more specialized stuff, those kind of relate to the other pieces of the application blueprint here for our HCM strategy and systems. So that goes into like service delivery. So you see 66% adoption of service delivery for the mid-market. And then we go into talent management and workforce management and then business intelligence. Now it's really important to think about where you want to get to. Now one of the things that's really obviously important for all organizations is your recruiting. So do you put in a recruiting solution? Do you put in performance and learning? Maybe, especially for mid-market organizations, you don't need succession planning, but that's something to think about along the lines. And what about workforce management? When you get to workforce management, it's important to be able to understand where your workforce is right then and there to be able to get to workforce optimization, especially for smaller organizations. You need every employee to count. You need them to be able to pull their weight, and you need to be able to understand what they're doing and how they're doing it, because without everybody working together, your organization doesn't have the ability to function the way it should. So you put all of those together, and then when you have all these solutions and then you have data, you're able to have actual good data to make business decisions. That's your business intelligence foundation here on the blueprint. So Stacey, is there anything else you'd like to add to that?
Just to note that the way we sort of look at this when we look at these numbers is that this means that those organizations have adopted 2 or more of these applications in what we would consider a category like workforce management or talent management. So over 80% of the market has a recruiting solution, but only about 50% of the market has recruiting with performance or learning or compensation or something along those lines, right? And that gives you a sense of sort of those organizations who have just bought sort of general a point solution versus those organizations who have invested in a category because it is a goal they're trying to achieve within their organization. And that's something that we see in the market. And the other thing is all the things on the outside of this, the networking, mobile access, the enterprise social, enterprise workflow, those are all the things we see people sort of working through, understanding within their enterprise system that they connect and make sure sort of work around their enterprise HR technology environments, and they have to understand how those things work together to make a total enterprise HCM application blueprint makes sense. You can't really talk about what your organization is going to be doing, say for example with service delivery and help desks and portal technologies, if you don't understand how your organization is handling things like various content, where are they holding documents, who's accessing those documents, and how do we manage the security around those documents. That's part of your portal technology decision making. So really great, Erin, sort of how all this fits together and how you have to sort of have a sense of where it's at and where you're planning to get to understand sort of your own health checkup and your business's health checkup from a systems perspective. Another way to look at sort of the transformation conversation that you might be having inside your company for the mid-market organizations is we find oftentimes organizations when they're thinking about sort of the goals they're trying to achieve, again, very similar to how I think about my personal health goals, right? For those of you who know me, exercise is something that I struggle with. I don't like to sweat, I admit it, but I try and go at least 3 times a week and get my exercise done. I've recently, not recently, in the last 2 years have started on a morning yoga because I need to stretch. I've got ankles that have been broken once or twice and need to stretch on a regular basis. And my personal goal from a healthcare perspective could be, oh, I just want to be able to sort of, make sure that I can walk 2 miles in a day. And that's great, right? That means I'm sort of more capable of doing something than I have been in the past. But what really probably is a better goal is to make sure that, by the time I'm, in my, sort of elderly stage, that I'm still able to walk altogether. There's an important long-term strategy that you might want to put in place to make sure that you're addressing all the healthcare things that you're dealing with. And we want to look at our HR technology strategies kind of the same way. If you look at things like I just want to lower costs, or I want to have less IT expense, or I want to have less maintenance that I got to deal with, that's why I'm moving to the cloud, right? Or I have fewer resources overall, so I don't have to invest in so many people working on my technology. It's really a short-term fix that oftentimes in today's modern HR technology environments, you might be able to accomplish in the first couple of years of transforming your HR technology environment because you become more efficient. But over time, we find that what organizations who really get the best outcomes, the longer term outcomes from their HR technology transformations, are looking at important things like the user experience. I now have a user experience that everybody in my company values, and my adoption increases, so the investment in my HR technology means more, and it means more to my end users. I have strategic data now to make data-driven decisions within my organization, so now we're not just going on hunches or on what my manager thinks is most important. We're actually being able to say make some decisions about here's data on what's happening and where we're headed from an employee perspective. I'm really thinking about continuous improvement. The long-term goal of my organization is that we really want to achieve maybe increasing market share. Well, market share isn't something that happens overnight. If you want to continuously improve, you have to think about it on a maintenance model, right? And same thing with process standardization. We're not really looking at fewer resources. Maybe if we want to enterprise-wide, processes, things that can standardize across the organization, that's going to allow us to work more efficiently, work more effectively, long-term, and add those resources back into more strategic roles within the organization once we process standardize. So we really think differently when we look at this HR technology environment sort of strategy and blueprints about where we want to get to and how we want to achieve them. Another thing that we often see inside of enterprise HR system strategies is where are we going to spend our resources? What's going to be our big initiatives? Erin, you want to talk a little bit about what we saw for the mid-market organizations this year?
So the big focus for the mid-market this year is definitely on talent management initiatives as compared to the rest of our data. They're 20% more likely to focus on talent management initiatives than the rest of our survey respondents. Now, a lot of the stuff actually stays standard for everyone who's taking the survey. Everybody's planning on making business process improvements. That's always for all of the years that we've been doing this. This is the most important piece. But the talent management piece really stuck out for Stacey and I because we wanted to see A, what the differences are, but B, we really want to point out that people in the mid-market have to pay attention to their talent. This is an area for a way to differentiate yourself, especially when you're in the mid-market, your talent management initiatives.
And what we also find is that many organizations, when they're dealing with this, are oftentimes looking at their application blueprints and saying, great, okay, so I know I need to invest in talent, or I need to improve my service delivery, or I figured out the direction I want to move. Okay, when do I need to make that move, right? At what point do I need to be making these decisions? Well, some of that has to do with your business or your industry or the direction that you're trying to achieve or how quickly you're trying to achieve it. But we also know there's a level of maturity that most organizations achieve over time. And so Erin and I said, well, maybe we can at least give some sense of advice to organizations trying to make some of these decisions about applications and at what point they might need certain type of applications over another application by just taking a look at the average adoption of various applications within the enterprise space by organizational size, and not just by our big categories, but going from 1,000 employees all the way up to 50,000 employees to say at what point are these changes being made. And what we find was sort of interesting. It was really almost kind of scary because normally when you look at research data, averages and means, and you try to look at stuff and things don't always work out the way you expect them to. So sometimes you get more or less, right, than what you expected. But with this case, we definitely saw that as organizations grew in size, they definitely adopted more overall HR technology applications as they increased their numbers, particularly those organizations who were sort of transferring from what we'd consider our large, which is 1,000 to 2,500 here in this, to the very large, which is 50,000 and above, right? What we found is that those organizations in between those areas really increased their numbers considerably, as well as those organizations from 1,000 to 3,000 employees, right? And so what we really find is that the data here gave us an opportunity, and I apologize, there's a typo in that large, and I just realized that should be 10,000 employees to 50,000 employees, and that's why I'm like, oh, that's not quite making sense. Nothing like seeing a typo while we're in the middle of the webinar. My apologies, folks. So please note the large here, and we'll make sure that when we get the updated deck for you to download, that will be 10,000 to 50,000 there. But what we're seeing is that jump between 10,000, 50,000, and 50,000 employees was pretty big, and that jump between 1,000 employees and 5,000 employees was pretty dramatic as well. And what we're seeing is that those organizations in that sort of mid-market space where we're focusing invested much more heavily in their talent management solutions as well as their workforce management solutions compared to other areas where they were adopting HR technology. We track over like 36 different HR application technologies, but the two areas that seemed to have the most growth in those ranges were the talent management and workforce management applications. We also oftentimes get asked, well, okay, we realize that we need to make a change. Maybe we've been with our current system for 5 years or 10 years or 11 years. We're a mid-market organization. There's not a lot of sort of finances to invest in this. Is this a time at which we really need to make a change to the cloud if we have an on-premise environment? So we oftentimes get asked, what is the breakout between those organizations who have what we call SaaS or cloud deployments versus on-premise deployments today? And we definitely see that in the mid-market space, for those organizations between 1,000 and 5,000 employees, that they are much more likely to be in the cloud at this point in their workforce management, payroll, core HRMS, and talent management than not in the cloud at this point in time. And they've moved there much more quickly than other categories have, so the very large organizations. But what I think is more interesting is that we definitely see a big difference in the overall average user experience scores between those organizations who have that on-premise deployment still versus those who have the cloud solutions. And so the reason for moving isn't just to change technology, and it isn't just about sort of finances and whether I can, reduce the cost and the administrative, all of those things that generally tend to make it into our big HR system strategies. But very similarly to sort of your health checkup, right? There's a lot of good reasons to maybe make a movement and a transformation effort. But one reason oftentimes is if I'm going to be able to do something, I want to be motivated to do it. I want to find some value in it that goes beyond just I should do it because my doctor says I should do it, right? And what we find for many organizations is that the reason they've made these changes to new technology today is really about two things. It's about the data they can get out of it, but also the user experience that their employees have with it. And we definitely see that those organizations have moved to cloud technologies at this point are definitely seeing higher average user experience scores on the mid-market. And we're seeing that more organizations are more rapidly reducing their on-premise deployments over the next 12 months compared to what we've seen in previous years. So what we're seeing is that about 44% of organizations plan to reduce their HRMS licensed on-premise environments. Now that doesn't mean all of them will be, it's going to be a one-to-one where we're going to see everybody move to a cloud core HRMS environment, because a lot of the organizations have multiple solutions in place right now, particularly if they're running global environments with multiple regions, but they're reducing the total number of HRMS licensed environments that they're having in place and maintaining over time out of the mid-market environments. Erin, you want to talk a little bit about why we think organizations are also doing this from a business perspective, not just user experience, with what we found in the high cloud versus low cloud adoption?
So we found, when we were looking at this, we found, we asked organizations whether or not their solution meets their HR solutions meet their business needs. So we had a number of options, but the top option was always, does your solution always meet your needs? And that we found that for organizations that were the high cloud, and I mentioned that previously, that you had your HRMS, your payroll, your talent management, and your workforce management in the cloud, you were more likely to have your needs met always, all of the time, versus organizations that were not in that high cloud group. So you can see the differences here, and they're significant. Your payroll is twice as likely to always meet your needs if you have all of your solutions in the cloud versus if you don't. Your HRMS 3 times as likely, your workforce management more than twice as likely, and again your talent management more than twice as likely to always meet your needs rather than not organizations that are not all in the cloud for all of those solutions.
Yeah, and this is really interesting, I think, because ultimately we know that HR technology is becoming commoditized. We all know this. Like most of the systems meet part of the time everything that we need. I think about 60% of organizations in our aggregate data said that the current technology mostly met their business needs, right? But the always meets my business needs, that's a pretty bold statement to say these system always meets my business needs. And to be able to say that 2 or 3 times more likely because I'm using a different type of technology is a pretty big factor. We also know that technology isn't the only thing that is going to have an impact on whether or not that enterprise HR system strategy is going to come to fruition, right? Technology transitions, transformations are a big part of it. Having the right technology, having a good user experience, all part of it. But we also know that it also comes down to how you roll that out, how you maintain that, what type of environment you create as far as adoption incentives and tools you put in place in the organization. Again, very similar to your healthcare environment. What kind of maintenance, what kind of check-ins, what kind of things are you always sort of insisting on doing to make sure that the exercises and the work that you're doing is paying off. And so what we see is that for mid-market organizations, about 21% of respondents report that they have what we consider a culture of change management. And a culture of change management really for us, kind of as an explanation, is an organization that has decided that change management isn't a project. It isn't something that we do at the beginning of a rollout of an implementation. It's something that we're doing on a continuous basis. We're always telling people what's updating, how to improve their use of their technology, how to improve the adoption of it. We're always giving them consistent sort of incentives for using the technology on a regular basis, and we're making sure that people are aware of the outcomes they can achieve by using the HR technology environments. And in today's environment, if you're going cloud, you really don't have much of a choice. Consistent change management allows you to make sure that as updates happen on a pretty regular basis in cloud technologies, that you have a process or an approach to making sure people are aware when those changes happen during updates that happen sometimes 2 to 3 times within a year for the enterprise HR technology environments that are in cloud environments. What we see is that mid-market organizations are less likely than any other group to do a level of continuous, consistent culture of change management. And that's really kind of sad, because what we're finding is that those organizations oftentimes are growing so rapidly or dealing with a lot of changes within their organization, and change management just isn't on the plate. There's just not enough time or resources to do it. And yet those organizations who do find time for it, right, they're 4 times. This is 4 times. This is a larger jump than we see anybody else. Like if you do continuous change management in your large organization, you get 2 times, which is still a good improvement, but 4 times more likely to be seen as an enterprise, as a strategic business partner to their management group. That consistent culture of change management allows you to have a communication line that's open all the time with your business leaders, all the time with your employees. It gives you an avenue to say, look, here's what this technology is doing for you. Here's why we need you to make sure that you're invested in it. Here's why we need to make sure it's being utilized. If you look at it as a project, which is what most people do, 42% of the group here in our research said they were doing this as a key projects. What you end up doing is that you end up sort of getting really excited about something. It becomes the HR technology flavor of the month, and people forget about it over time. That's not what you want to see in a mid-market space. You have too few resources and not enough money to invest in something that's not going to be adopted over time. When we ask organizations what a culture of change management looks like in their environments, what we see is this idea of sort of adopt, adapt, and then go back and provide feedback. Being an agile development or agile rollout environment, what we're seeing is people are saying, look, let's adopt it, let's see what's working, let's get some feedback and go back and make changes. Hey, look, we got some new updates, some new opportunities, let's adopt it, adapt it, and give some feedback to the market. This idea of continuous feedback works here as well as it does with any of your performance management processes or your employee relationships as well. We also see that these are organizations that oftentimes focus on things like the speed at which they can roll things out, ongoing governance, what we call robust sustainment support models, meaning they have maintenance models and sustainment tools in place to make sure that things are sort of audited and checked on a regular basis when they're doing updates with their technologies. These are type of things that allow organizations to get out of the business of just fixing breaks or fixing technical glitches, and allow them to focus on the value they can create with many of these technologies. Erin, you want to talk a little bit about process maturity and why that is so important when organizations are developing a really good enterprise HR system strategy as well?
So when we're asking organizations about their processes, we want to know whether or not your process, well, how you would rank your process. So our options are whether or not your process is transformational. Is it unique? Does it stand above others? These are really the best of the best. Then we want to know if it's effective. Does it do what you need it to do? Is it strategically focused? Is it aligned with your business strategy? Then we get into efficient. Is it just transaction focused? Does it work but maybe not so hot. And then manual, is it paper-based, not standardized, ad hoc, reactive to things that are going on. And one of the reasons that we use these is that we have our data-driven and talent-driven organizations, and one of the ways that we look at these, discover these organizations, one of the ways we categorize them is by their process maturity. And data-driven and talent-driven organizations have transformational or effective processes, where our non-data-driven and our non-talent-driven organizations have either efficient or manual processes.
And your process is sort of like all your muscles and connectivity. These are things that help things sort of work more effectively. No matter how good the technology is, if you don't have change management, if you don't have good process management, you really aren't going to be able to achieve the outcomes that you're trying to with HR technology. Another thing that's important these days with HR technology systems and strategies is understanding, look, as good as we are, as much as we try and manage our health, as much as we try and manage all the things that we're doing in our organizations, we also have to understand that it's really important to manage our safety and our security. And particularly with HR technology, this is a really big conversation. One of the things we ask each year is whether or not organizations feel that their data privacy processes are as mature as they need to be, and whether or not they have enough protection in place for their employees. Now, granted, we see about 51% of organizations feel they have a pretty effective data privacy environment within their organization. Having a good enterprise HR system allows you to have the basics covered in many cases. But what we found is that high cloud organizations were 21% more likely to be confident in their data privacy processes. And we were sort of like, oh, that's sort of interesting. What are we seeing here? And when we went back and sort of talked to a lot of organizations about this, what we found is that oftentimes organizations who had gone through the process of transferring their environment, moving into a cloud environment, really had to rethink in some cases what they were trying to do with data privacy. Where previously they had sort of just said, well, we lock everything down, we put it behind our firewall, nobody can have access to it. Well, cloud technologies are something we want people to use. We don't want to have people have to access it only through a VPN. We don't want to have people have to have problems accessing it. We want people to be able to access it, get into it, be able to have data available to make decisions. We have a lot of bring your own device technology. We have a lot of standards going out in places right now where people are sort of accessing data as they're working on the job. So what we found is that what organizations really did when they had many of these cloud technologies in place is they not only thought about sort of the technical aspects of security and data privacy, making sure that all of their connections were secure, which most of the time you'll find in most cloud-based technology environments that they're very focused on this because they're very focused on making sure that there's no data breaches across their entire population that they're serving, not just you individually. But also, we found that in many cases, they had from their best practices called from all the other organizations the processes that need to be addressed. So for example, if someone changes something like a payroll connection, right? Like I want my payroll now sent to this checking account to this versus this checking account. Well, if you don't have set up in place something like an email that's sent automatically out when that change takes place, when something like that might happen, maybe someone might have hacked into it, got into the environment, that email is sort of a way of double checking what's happening. We'll see dual logic and dual mobile sort of logins now, where if I'm going to log into a system, I have to have my phone or maybe a phone call that is sent out that says, hey, someone's trying to log into this environment under your name. Is this you? Are you sure, right? Just simple things like that where we change the process makes such a difference. And that type of sort of security and safety makes a big difference for organizations who are trying to sort of build out a strategy and make sure that the strategy is not something where they're sort of just putting everything behind a firewall, but they're making it available, accessible, and still safe and secure. Finally, one of the other things that we see in the market is whether or not organizations are focused on sort of the when they look at what organizations are trying to achieve, is they're oftentimes trying to achieve sort of a relationship with their vendor that is positive and satisfying. Erin, when we looked at this data, vendor relationships are a big conversation right now, and it's a big part of any HR technology enterprise strategy that you have. What kind of relationship do you want to have with your vendor? What were the things that correlated highest with what we would consider those people who felt they had low vendor satisfaction versus those who had high vendor satisfaction?
So when we look at this, the thing that most correlated with low vendor satisfaction was a poor user experience. If your user experience is not so hot, people don't want to use it, they don't like it, they feel like it's clunky or old, that very much contributed highly to low levels of vendor satisfaction. Also, along with that, lack of innovation. If you're not trying to stay abreast with market trends and changes and features and functions that people are interested in, that people don't like that. And then the integration was the third highest thing that correlated with low vendor satisfaction. If you're not able to take this data and use it within other systems, that was a big negative for organizations. And then, surprisingly, our fourth thing on here is high cost. Now, when Stacey and I actually looked at this, we pulled out organizations that actually had a higher cost. Stacey, I don't know if you remember when we did this, but we actually looked at organizations that paid more, and they were always happier.
Yeah, it was sort of an odd thing, like people who said that the reason they were incentivized is because they had a high cost, but those weren't the people who were paying the most, is the way Erin's saying this, right? People who were paying most were actually higher. So it's sort of an odd dynamic, which was really, really sort of strange when you look at that, is that sometimes perception is everything, right? So if you feel like you're paying more than you should, your user experience isn't good, then that adds to it. Those are the things that sort of really had an impact. But it's great connection, Erin. I'd forgotten about that. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. But for the organizations who were actually paying the most, they were not unhappy with their solutions. And then, updates and upgrades, that correlated to lower vendor satisfaction. Now, when we look at higher vendor satisfaction as a service and support, what you're really paying for, in many cases, is your vendor. Let's face it, a lot of the solutions on the market today offer very similar functionality. You're always going to find a vendor or a solution that meets your needs better than another vendor. But by and large, if you're buying a payroll software, most of the time it's going to handle most of your payroll needs. But what you're going to be dealing with all of the time is that particular vendor. So the service and support, and whether or not you like that vendor and that vendor service and support, highly correlates with vendor satisfaction. Also, best practice functionality and integrated solutions. We talked about that a little bit earlier with low vendor satisfaction, but people are happy when they have best practice functionality and when their solutions are integrated. And also the ability to customize and overall user experience also correlated with high vendor satisfaction. Notice that cost was not one of the correlations of high vendor satisfaction here, but we did find that in our data.
Yeah, and what was interesting is that the ability to customize, we sort of got into this and people have always asked us, well, what do you mean by the ability to customize? What we found is a lot of organizations have industry-specific needs that they're dealing with, right? Things that they're trying to do. Ability to customize isn't that they're customizing oftentimes that system. We often found that sometimes that was how things were integrated, or they were able to maybe do some sort of an element that sort of connected more effectively to that system. So we saw organizations who were leveraging platform as a service were able to maybe add some sort of external modules that connected very seamlessly with that solution, made a big difference for them. Just the ability to add those unique elements that are important to you, whether that's through configuration or true customization, was important to people when they were looking at this. So great components. Another thing that was really important was how people were able to access the data. And Erin, when we talk about enterprise HR system strategy, we oftentimes forget how important it is to think about the fact that people will be accessing this information in different places. What did we find on mobile? Is MidMarket definitely using more mobile these days?
MidMarket is definitely seeing higher levels of mobile adoption. Now, in general, you can see from our 2014 data to our 2016 data and then plans for the next 12 months, we're seeing huge increases in mobile-enabled HR technology. Basically, most of the adults in the U.S. workplace have a smartphone. And, the data would bear this out. Like, look, people carry around these devices. And if your people are not able to access your systems via a mobile device, that could be a problem for a lot of people, especially when you get younger generations coming into the workforce who essentially expect to be able to do that. Their lives revolve around their mobile phones, and they want to be able to access everything, including all of their work applications, via that mobile device. So we see mobile adoption for the mid-market for HR technology actually slightly higher than our overall average, with 42% of the mid-market having mobile technology for their HR solutions for their employees. We also see that organizations that don't have it are planning on, 21% are planning on having it within the next 12 months, 8% are evaluating, and then 29% don't have any plans for that mobile technology adoption.
Yeah, it's not on this particular slide, but there's a stat we have in our larger report that basically shows that those organizations who have no plans for mobile technology correlate pretty heavily with also those organizations who have no confidence from their business partners and their role as an HR environment, right? So there is a deep connection between sort of this mobile technology. You would think, well, it's just a delivery mechanism. It shouldn't be any different than anything else. But I think part of this comes down to it's not just next gens. Like, Erin's saying that's sort of expected from them. But, your business leaders are on their mobile technologies all the time. They're making decisions day and night. They're being, they want their HR technology accessible too. And if a business leader wants you as a partner, they really expect it to be mobile. And so we're seeing a lot of that come out in the conversations that we're having with organizations.
But it's not just mobile technologies. Stacey's going to the next slide, and we're talking about social technologies as well. In the mid-market, social technologies, the number of organizations that are strategically using social technologies today only continues to increase.
Yeah, we're at a point now where over 50% of organizations are using Facebook as a strategic element of their HR technology environments. Think about that. If you're not using Facebook, more than 50% of the market is using it as a strategic element in some way. A lot of it's recruiting, but it's not the only way that we're seeing organizations use it. We're seeing it used in conversations, relationship building. Twitter's at 50%, and my favorite is that Snapchat is at 5%. In the mid-market, and that's much higher than it is for the aggregate overall, isn't it, Erin? So
it is, but I don't know if you saw the article last week, Stacey, that McDonald's was going to start doing you're going to be able to Snapchat an application at McDonald's. So
it's not, yeah, it's definitely something that we're seeing grow in the market as a whole, and you can't ignore it if you have been for the last couple of years. And part of the challenge is that we know that for mid-market organizations, all of this seems a bit overwhelming. It seems like there's just so many things that you've got to accomplish. Well, one way to try and get your arms wrapped around it is just take an hour a week. We talked. I just had this conversation with a couple of organizations that were on a panel that I was doing up in Toronto for the IRM. Every one of them who have recently sort of done some HR tech transformation, every one of them said, look, if I had an enterprise HR system strategy at the beginning of the process, I would have made different and better decisions than I have today. And all of them said the same thing. They said, look, it takes an hour or two a week of investing some time in a strategy, building together a coalition of people who want to talk about it, investing a little bit of time, identifying what you're trying to achieve out of it, trying to get all the data pulled together. If your organization doesn't have full-blown strategies that they've put in place. I know a lot of mid-market organizations haven't gotten to this point where they've got these big sort of rolling goals within their organization, but you do know how decisions are being made. You know the big things that your senior executives are watching every day. Just use the data that you have available, and that enterprise HR system strategy becomes a big part of how you're able to make this world seem a little bit more manageable. It's just like any other exercise program. You've got to get started. You got to build out sort of the core elements, and you've got to build on top of it. Common sense benchmarking and clear planning, allowing for realistic expectations. I can't say this enough. How many times do we have people, Erin, who call us up and say, look, you guys say that they spend X amount per employee, per payroll. That's twice what my company spends. I can't, how am I supposed to justify that? I'm like, well, first of all, we have to know a heck of a lot more about your organization to tell you if you compare it all to the average. This is a starting point, a conversation starter when you look at our data and with anybody else's data. Benchmarking is something you should look at. And in some cases, you may not want to match everybody. If you're really focusing on critical talent in your organization, do you want to spend the minimum or the average? You probably want to spend a lot more on that talent area. And so you really have to think about what your goal you're trying to achieve and how that should be translated into technology decisions. Finally, change management is more than a project. If I say it once, I say it 100 times. Please, 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 please get your organization to understand that change management is no longer something that you do training in the big, when you roll out something and it's a big party when the project ends. It really has to do with constant communications. If you remember nothing else from today's conversation, constant communications with employees about what your HR technology is trying to achieve and trying to get out and trying to do is important. Don't just touch them once a year when you're doing your benefits rollout. Don't just touch them once the new system rolls out. Think about how you can constantly be informing them of what this technology does, because if they're not using it, you're not getting the value out of it. And finally, emerging technology is about achieving outcomes. Mobile, social, we gave you some nice stats, some things that you can think about, but the reason these things are growing in adoption isn't just because they're cool or they're new, but they're really about what people are trying to achieve. If your business leaders are on their phones and they're on their business environments trying to get things accomplished, you need to take the content to them where they're making the decisions. If the recruits you're looking for or the people that you're trying to connect with are in the social environment, you need to make sure that you're reaching them in those environments. And as a mid-market organization, more than anyone else, you have to be a little bit ahead of the curve because you're fighting for talent in a way that most organizations, maybe who have more money or more brand or more capabilities, are able to maybe offer more. What you want to do is be able to say, look, we're different and here's how we're different. And your ability to do that has a lot to do with your social and your mobile and your brand management conversations. So we talked a lot, I mean, there's a lot of information that we've just sort of laid out about how organizations sort of tie together their sort of HR technology strategies and their whole environments to get ready for where they want to take their business. Erin, any last minute comments for the audience on, you know, maybe how they can download the survey or participate this year and maybe give their comments going forward?
Absolutely. So as Stacey mentioned earlier, all of this data that we have here comes from the Sierra-Cedar HR Systems Survey, which is currently open. I'm going to close it just at the beginning of next month, July 2nd, maybe the 3rd, depending on how our vacation time looks, around the 4th of July. But you can still participate. We would love to have your feedback about your organization, and we can use that to do a better job of giving you new data next year. Now, also, Stacey mentioned benchmarking. If you complete the survey, I will personally prepare for you a snapshot report that looks at how your organization compares to the organizations who took the survey in either your industry, your region, or your size last year. So that part of that benchmarking that we talked about, I will give you some stats that will help you look at that for your organization. It's also a great benchmark for where your organization is for your HR systems and solutions, and you'll get a PDF of all of your answers once you're finished with the survey, so you can take that and check in next year and when you take the survey again, and you can see how you've changed, etc. We also have another webinar coming up in this series. We have a webinar done by Richard George, our VP of Strategic Services, and that's going to be Tuesday, July 18th at 11 a.m. Pacific time.
If anybody has any questions, I know we're sort of running a little slow on time today, but if you have anything, we'll try and stay after for a little bit, answer any questions you might have about the research or the data, and we're happy to answer any questions you might want to send via email, and we're there, or via Twitter if you want as well. Jana, I'm going to turn it over to you because I think you're going to talk a little bit about sort of where they can access the information going forward and how they get SHRM credits for this as well, correct?
Yes, definitely. And Stacey and Erin, as usual, this was a fantastic webinar. Thank you both so much for taking the time to present this all to us. And to our attendees, thank you for joining us today. We will be sending an email with links to download the mid-market white paper, as well as the 19th annual HR Systems Survey white paper. And included in this email will also be links to access the webinar and a copy of the PDF of this presentation online. And then within that email, there'll be a final link that'll direct you to a short 3 to 5 minute survey. We would greatly appreciate any feedback you have on today's webinar and any ideas you have for future webinars. That way we can help to curate future ones for you all. I hope you have a great rest of the day, and thank you again for joining us.